Introduction. Okay. And you can all see the slides here.
Yes.
So, um, today I'm going to be presenting on urban development and housing, and in particular addressing, I think, what is a lacuna in scholarship on the city of Rome. That is that the evidence from housing is often neglected, and I think this is a bit of a shame because it can inform our understanding of how a city at a time of tremendous change, tremendous socio-economic turmoil, transforms. Okay, so across the presentation, I'm first going to deliver an overview, presents as it were, the stage, the problem of late Republican Rome and how we conceptualize change. I'm then going to address the theoretical base for the arguments, addressing two aspects, what is a city, and then how we define the city. And this is, in fact, crucial to the later portions of the presentation when we try to move through qualitative and quantitative analyses of the city. I then present the main body of research from my presentation, that is Roman housing, utilizing a catalogue of houses that I've compiled over whilst completing a chapter of my PhD thesis. Following that, I present a broader suite of evidence, that is, the evidence beyond housing, further evidence for urban development in Rome across the period. And then I tie everything together, return to the theoretical base, combine the evidence, and try to reflect on housing and population and how this evolves across the period in question. So, all of you, of course, will know that this period, from approximately 200 to 31 BC, bounded between the end of the Second Punic War down to the Battle of Actium, this is the time where Rome accrues most of its military territories through military campaigns, morphing in essence from a fairly small state based on the Italian peninsula to this behemoth spanning the entirety of the Mediterranean. And importantly, what happens is all of this floods back to the city of Rome, enacting great changes on the city in terms of monumentalizing the city, in terms of vast demographic, economic, and social changes. And we see this in three particular parts of the city, as illustrated by Penelope Davies's plans here. So the northern part, the Campus Martius, is monumentalized, and especially through the completion of new manubial buildings, temples, entertainment structures. We then also have the political heart, the Forum Romanum in the centre, again monumentalized, spatially transformed, and with it the nearby Forum Boarium, Forum Holitorium areas. And then another area that I'll discuss briefly towards the end of this presentation, the so-called Emporium part of Rome by the southern bend of the River Tiber. And as to the nature of these changes, we have monumental temples, we have some quite inventive architectural forms, the proliferation of marble as well, proliferation of new constructional techniques, including vaults, arches, enabling the construction of very significant monumental sanctuaries. There's also significant entertainment structures as well, most notably the Theatre of Pompey, completed in 55 BC. But we shouldn't also neglect the temporary arenas, spectacular, which were again incredibly transformative spatially. Here depicted one in the Forum Romanum. And the final main category of change at a fairly substantial monumental level is infrastructure. And we see this in the form of new bridges, sewers, embankments along the Tiber, and of course, aqueducts. So, thus far, the picture that I've hopefully impressed on you is an image of very significant change. and the city that responds to all of its military conflicts and the spoils that return to Rome. When starting the PhD, I noted in my introduction that across this period, Rome probably rose to become the most populous city in Europe before London in the 19th century, and London at this stage having itself undergone a very substantial urban transformation, rising to a population of perhaps 1 million. Well, there were probably quite good grounds for this. So the orthodoxy, the scholarly orthodox opinion is that we often see this figure of about 1 million for an urban population of Rome asserted. And Patterson in the Companion to the Roman Republic notes that from the beginning of the second century and the end of the, sorry, I can't quite say this. Okay, the end of the first, the population of Rome increased apparently very roughly from some 200,000 to a million. Note in particular the apparently increase, the uncertainty here. Yet nevertheless, this opinion is one that is stressed, is repeated, and is used to base further judgments on the scale and character of Rome over this period. And I think when graphed, as shown by a work by Matthew Mandich here, so on the x-axis we have years, the y-axis population. This represents a fairly common scholarly view, namely that Rome's population, it wasn't really paralleled its peak until the 18th, 19th centuries AD. And when we focus on the period in question, 200 BC down to the turn of the century, what this means, or this interpretation indicates, is we're envisioning a linear rate of increase and then an apex in terms of Rome's scale or population, not simply by the high imperial period, but even before then, by 31 BC, by the end of the Republic. I think, and over the remainder of this presentation, I'm going to go into a bit more detail and try to navigate this trend and see if it is indeed reflected by the evidence. At this point, I'll just note where this paper fits in. So this is part of my PhD research. I'm presenting one particular chapter of this, which focuses on urban expansion. And the thesis as a whole, there are two main foci, focusing on the building industry and then urban development. And there's a series of different prongs and methodological approaches which approach this. So now we've introduced the problem. Now we can turn to the theory and try to conceptualize the city, think about how to engage with the city and how, with a city as vast, complicated, and with a very complex archaeological and literary record, how we can try to understand this. So the first aspect to consider is, and this is confronted by many urbanists, is what is a city? Well, for one as Rome, we hardly need to consider this. This was considered urbs, the city, a city hardly requiring a name due to its unparalleled scale, the virtuoso elements of its architecture, its grandeur, and its importance to the Roman state. The second question, however, where does a city start or end? This is more complex. And with, I suppose, smaller settlements, this is fairly easy to navigate. Often natural barriers, rivers, or fortifications for the ancient city. These can often indicate the barrier, but certainly for larger urban settlements, it's far more nebulous, hard to discern where one city starts, where a suburb begins, where it ends, and this ultimately leads to a subjective assessment of this. Now we can turn to the ancient city, and illustrated by the Avezzano relief, we're confronted by two different pictures here. we have the urban, the orthogonal city contained within the urban boundary. And then beyond that, on the other side, we have rural, separated clearly, and yet at the same time, it isn't a stark decline in the density of the space depicted here, but we nevertheless do see a more variegated landscape, different architectural features, funerary structures, more marginal land uses. So we're very much led to confront the idea of, is this a binary of urban rural? Is it more amorphous, hard to define, or so on? And we're not alone in confronting this. The ancient literary sources, individuals living in Rome itself, had to confront this. So Varro, in a theoretical discussion about the nature of the Roman villa, confronts the idea of, is a building a villa simply because it exists outside the city? Well, possibly not. So again, there's a lack of clarity about what exactly is urban and what is not. And many individuals have confronted this, including with models of urban growth from modern urbanism, most famously perhaps the Bergquist model of urban growth, indicating a concentric form of growth with the density of buildings declining with distance from the city. This has also seen an increased level of interest over the last few years with a proliferation of quite important works on city boundaries, on suburb, including the works of Saskia Stevens, Matthew Mandich, Alison Emerson, and Penelope Goodman, all important works which have probed the various types of boundaries, their utility, and evidence for these. As for Rome itself, what boundaries can we consider and which are relevant to Republican Rome? Well, firstly, we have the historic boundaries. We have the Servian Wall, which, depending on your point of view, either exists from the 6th century BC or the 4th century BC. This is monumental, permanent, and in some ways delimits growth of the city. There's also the religious and legal barrier of the Pomerium, which undergoes various expansions over time, including certainly by Claudius and Vespasian, and again in the imperial periods, including new areas of the city previously not included within this boundary. And then there's also slightly more controversial views on this boundary and its changes potentially under the likes of Sulla, Caesar, or Augustus. Also deserving mention are the the institution of the 14 Augustan regions in 7 BC. So we also have the Passus Milo, this being a, a legal boundary which appears, I believe, first in the Tabula Heracliensis, delimiting a legal zone 1,000 steps. Yet where exactly this begins or ends is quite uncertain. Whether this is the city wall that starts this boundary or not is slightly up for question. There's also this additional term, the continentia aedificia, which again appears in legal sources and again is, whilst it expresses this view of built area, again outside the city wall, it's quite hard to define. But taken as a trio, these three boundaries or attempts to map space, all of these appear by the Augustan period, and all of these reflect a growing need and necessity to try to navigate and administer and to deconstruct space, potentially indicating that by this time the Romans themselves are negotiating a rapidly transforming urban space which is in need of new boundaries, new ways of administering space. And then finally, also of note, although potentially less relevant to the presentation today, is the boundary of the former Urbis and then the Aurelian walls. But now I think, so I presented a number of boundaries about how we might approach space, I think one which has been neglected is actually the physical area for where Romans themselves lived. And I think this boundary or this means of attempting to measure spatial change, focusing on land use, in fact, has quite a lot of value. So, housing, and this will be the main point of evidence across the presentation. I'm going to go through treatments of Roman housing, explaining why there's a bit of a gap in scholarship. I'll then focus on the distribution and chronology of these houses and what that shows before finally moving through the nature of this evidence, what can be discerned from the archaeology and literary evidence, and then focusing on an area which is more absent, but nevertheless needs to be considered, and those are the spaces of the less affluent, the non-elites in Roman society. As far as treatments of Roman housing goes, I find that Rome, it plays, despite the importance of the city, Rome plays a relatively little of a role in discussions of Roman housing. There's a very strong evidence from the Bay of Naples area and for Ostia for imperial housing. And some of the main handbooks, these of course excellent works, but evidence from the Bay of Naples and Ostia is far more abundant within these works than evidence from Rome itself. Further complicating this is that when Rome and its archaeology is also discussed, we're in general limited to a fairly reduced corpus of houses: the House of the Griffins, the House of Livia, the Aula Isaaca, the House of Augustus. And mostly these appear due to either their political significance or due to their decorative features. And in some treatments, housing is altogether absent, and we often see the pairing of literary evidence from Rome with archaeological evidence from beyond Rome. And I'll just issue a caveat, that is that the evidence from Pompeii, from the Bay of Naples, from Ostia, of course, it's crucial. It's very important, and the fragments of information we're able to draw from these, from small finds, from epigraphic evidence, from organic materials, that is, of course, substantially different and poses different research questions to that which I'm engaged with today. We should not discard that. I simply think that the evidence from Rome, it does deserve treatment and appearing and a place within discussions of Roman housing. As for treatments of Roman housing, there are a few notable ones. We have the Lexicon Topographicum Urbis Romae, compiling the literary record of housing. We also have, importantly, the work by Carandini, although this focuses primarily on, as indicated by the title, the houses in the most prominent parts of the city and those associated with political prestige and influence. So houses in the Forum Romanum area, on the Palatine, and on the Velian Hill. And then regarding Insuli, there's this important work by Preuster, but this is perhaps less essential to the Republican period, mainly due to the absence of evidence. What I've done with this chapter, I've approached this by trying to catalogue a lot of the evidence, trying to look at some of the houses that have been overlooked or neglected. And I'll preface this by noting that this is, of course, not the first attempt to catalogue houses. We have very important works by the Hasselbergers, August in Rome. There's also the Atlante by Carandini and Carafa, and more recently still, there's the Webb-Sitar catalogue of houses there as well. So there are, of course, very important efforts. As for the actual numbers of houses, I've catalogued these in three different ways. Those which are definitely houses, those backed by substantial archaeological remains, of which I found 69 of these. Possible domus sites, the uncertainty there being for two main reasons: either that The date of these remains is uncertain. They might not be late Republican in nature, or the remains are suitably fragmentary to such an extent that they might not be houses. And then there's also those known from the literary record. As for the data, these are the main categories of data that I've collected. This will, of course, vary by house. So for some houses, much of this will not be evident or able to be detailed. I've also, absent from this slide as well, also tried to compile evidence for the rooms, the features of these houses. And when combined, I think this can be quite useful for understanding urban growth and development. So, Cicero, writing to his brother Quintus, he notes that he is building, and these are some quite affectionate remarks that reproduce the extent of building activity in this time. So Cicero notes he is building in three places, refurbishing the rest. He lives on a rather more handsome scale nowadays than he used to, but this was necessary, and that if he had Quintus with him, Quintus would take second place to the builders for a spell. This conveys the extent of building activity in Rome. It's tremendous. It's the building industry would have been a core part of the urban environment. Many of the financial resources would have been invested in the purchase, the construction, the elaboration of houses in Rome. And we see this when this sample is mapped. So here we have in red, we have the two fortification circuits of Rome. We have the Servian Wall and then the much later Aurelian Wall, and then the houses, when planned, plotted in black. And the pattern here is immediately evident. It's that we have the houses datable to late Republican Rome, almost entirely based within the ancient urban fortification, with a small number of houses appearing beyond this boundary. Most of these either associated with Horti, potential villa sites, or a few outliers. But the pattern is nevertheless quite clear. And when we sweep over the parts of Rome itself, if we go by the Viminal and Oppian hills, and then Palatine Hill and the center of Rome, and then over to the Aventine Hill, we can see that there are clusters of these houses in essentially three main locations, three main parts of Rome where there's a high density of these houses surviving from the archaeological record. But that said, I think there's fairly good grounds that this is a pattern that is reproduced across the city, including in areas where we perhaps don't have houses in so great numbers. And the reasons for this is mostly due to places where we wouldn't expect evidence for houses to be found. So places concealed by later imperial buildings, so on the Calian Hill, then in the urban centre with the imperial fora, later areas occupied by imperial bathing complexes on the Viminal Hill, and then also where the late Quirinal Palace and the Italian government buildings are based, again, where we'd expect a shortage or a lack of suitable archaeological data. Okay, so the next point, which I find quite interesting from this sample, is that we are often led to believe that Roman housing is, or elite housing, is especially abundant in certain parts of the city and absent in large numbers from others. That we have a Rome highly separated by socio-economic class. This has been challenged in some recent scholarly works, important works by Margaret Andrews and by Lisa Mignogno on the Suburra region and then on the Aventine Hill, respectively, indicating that this narrative of distinction, separation, and zoning by socioeconomic class might not in fact be so prevalent across the city. And I think this sample here, this in fact supports such opinions. We have, again, clusters of housing on the Aventine, traditionally perceived as a plebeian or less affluent part of Rome, and then also in the Subura Valley as well. So I think we're probably dealing with, and when I go into the nature of these houses, explaining that most of these are indeed the houses of wealthy Romans, we're seeing a Rome where wealth is abundant across the city. That said, I think we cannot neglect the importance of the traditional places, the traditional epicenters of wealth and socioeconomic status. And of course, housing is an important form of social economic capital. And when the houses from the literary record are quantified, analysed, you do in fact see a slightly different phenomenon here, and that is that the Palatine and the Forum Romanum, these are the areas most prevalent in the literary scholarship. But this isn't unexpected. We're highly reliant on the works of Cicero, who himself lived on the Palatine, and this phenomenon is quite explainable, I think. So we have the houses in question. Another useful thing we can glean from this evidence is chronology. And I think this is quite a profound phenomenon that we see when these dates of these houses, both from the literary and archaeological evidence, when they are graphed, we see a very steep S-shaped curve. And I'm going to argue towards the end of this presentation that this can in fact inform our understanding of population and the rate of the transformation of the city. There are again a few caveats. This is this has been dated by a lot of averaging of houses, so hence we see a very substantial rise at about 50 BC. There's also individual rises at the time of Cicero when his own house is destroyed by Clodius, so he discovers a tremendous interest in the houses of his peers, hence certain peaks. But I don't think this shape of the graph is without merit or without use for understanding Rome in this period. There are a few caveats again for this. The primary means for dating these houses are based on wall painting evidence, first and second style paintings, again mosaic and pavement typologies, and then to a lesser extent ceramic, numismatic, and stratigraphic evidence. There's also the problems that go with these forms of evidence, subjectivity, the dependence on each of these chronological indices upon the other. So, for instance, wall facings informing the datings of pavements and also of wall painting styles as well. So there's quite a lot of association between these diagnostics for dating the buildings. And there's also the problem of problematic pairing of archaeological and literary evidence. So some scholars identify the houses of particular Romans from the archaeological evidence. I think we probably need to be a bit more cautious approaching this. And then in some of the sources that I've compiled these dates and evidence from, you don't in fact have the dating criteria provided. That said, however, there is hope. So we do have revisions to some of these typological sequences, so emergence of concrete in late Republican Rome. This, through Marcello Borghetta's recent revision, has shown that this probably appeared later, not in the early 2nd century BC, but in fact more towards the middle of the 2nd century and then onwards. There's also revisions to the late 2nd style wall painting scheme, that this probably wasn't an Augustan phenomenon, but in fact could have occurred a bit earlier in the late Republican period. And what we can gain from this is that this graph, this could in fact be even more compressed rather rather than more spread out. So whilst I don't think the slope of this graph, as steep as this is, I think that could be revised. I think the overall shape of the graph is of utility. I'm going to speed up a little as I go through the evidence. Just briefly to summarize the nature of most of these houses, most of these are in fact quite sizable. A lot of these are about 600 to 800 meters in scale. This isn't representative of all houses in Rome, simply this sample here. But we can say from this sample that we're dealing with quite large houses overall, those which are on average a lot larger than from the Pompeian sample, averaging about 300 meters squared. And also have noticed that many of these have subterranean spaces. Often it's the subterranean spaces that survive. So we could be dealing in some cases with houses of well over 1600 meters square, and that doesn't account even for the presence of upper stories. So quite large indeed houses across Rome. There's also the issue of the morphology or structure of these houses. Many of these houses are quite fragmentary and plans aren't always attainable, but we can reconstruct some, and quite a lot of these plans, they do conform quite nicely to the archetypal Pompeian house with its axiality, with its linear form being uh, rectilinear in shape, and often featuring this traditional Falco's atrium tablinum axis. So we see a number of these across the city, and potentially Republican houses as well from the much later former Urbis. So across this sample, we progressively see across the first century BC this shift away from the atrium nucleus, this traditional form of the Roman house that I've just detailed. We see plenty of proprietors purchasing neighboring plots of land, expanding their houses, and in many of these cases where we have peristyles or gardens towards the rear of the house, we might envisage that originally we could have had two separate distinct properties. And what we might want to imagine here is that we see something quite similar to that occurring in Pompeii over time, where we see originally quite a regular urban plan, but we see the expansion of individual properties over time, the addition of peristyles, upper stories, and by the imperial period, we have something that hardly resembles the original urban plan. Going back to the late Republican houses, many of these are also identified through decorative features, which again illustrate signs of luxury. We're generally dealing with quite a luxurious sample of Roman houses. Thus, that many of these, with their frescoes, their sculptural elements, their opus sculptulatum mosaics, these are representative of an elite body of owners. I'm probably going to skip this next part for time. So I've touched on elite housing. What of the remainder of urban evidence for housing across this period? We certainly know of multi-story houses, but the problem is that at least in this catalogue of evidence that I've compiled, there simply isn't the evidence for the insulae, the multi-story buildings which we're led to believe from Roman sources would have housed Rome's masses. And there is indeed plenty of literary evidence for this. The problem is that it doesn't survive, and that we can't really quantify or engage with the abundance of this evidence across Rome. So I think the likely conclusion here is that there certainly was much of this evidence, but due to either its poor quality, the decisions of those in control of the buildings, or its constructional materials, or simply the nature that it was more likely to be demolished, rebuilt, we unfortunately don't have this. So we have to bear this in mind. and especially when we get to the final portion of the presentation, that we can't really engage with this archaeologically in this period. The final part of evidence that I'll introduce here is the evidence from the remainder of the city. So evidence from beyond housing. So we know from the literary record that Rome expanded to a very considerable extent, such that from Dionysius of Halicarnassus, that there were buildings all beyond the Servian wall, such that a visitor would hardly have been able to discern where the city started or ended. I think, however, this could be questioned, at least in terms of the rate of change and the whereabouts. So I'm going to quickly turn to this part of Rome, the Emporium, the traditional depot for Rome's trade goods. And this is generally thought, often in scholarship, to have emerged from the start of the 2nd century BC, right after the Second Punic War. This relies on this passage from Livy, noting the construction of a portico outside the Porta Trigemina with a market and an emporium added alongside this. And we have a number of other buildings constructed in this area, various other porticos, a staircase, a forum. So there's a lot of building activity here, and this again has been taken to indicate a substantial market area. Much of this hinges on this particular building, the Testaccio building, identified often as the Porticus Aemilia. It's 500 meters long, very large indeed. But the problem is that, and I follow here the arguments of Kotzer and Tucci in 2006, the problem is that this is probably not the Porticus Aemilia, and that the theory of the building as ship sheds for housing ships, namely Navalia, this is probably more plausible. And that when this is combined with the remainder of the archaeological evidence for the region, the remaining buildings surrounding this, what we probably have is a late 2nd century BC structure where the remainder of this region dovetails this, follows this with increasing vigor from the end of the 2nd century BC. So we're probably not dealing in this part of Rome with a developed area by the 2nd century. We're probably saying this from the early to middle of the 1st century BC onwards. Ergo, we're having a less populous Rome, less trade facilities, and a less sizable Rome earlier on in the period. This is also shown, we can also see this in the northern parts of Rome. A recent study by Alice and Emerson on this Via del Tritone part of Rome, it shows that across the Republican period, we're mainly dealing with an area occupied by funerary structures. Over the imperial period, this changes. We see housing, we see quite dense housing appear. Again, the idea of a Rome that expands far much more in the imperial period. And I think when we combine this picture with housing and with the locations of Rome's gardens, I think by the end of the Republican period, the pattern is clear. We're dealing with quite a small city, one that hasn't reached its peak. So if we return to this graph that I showed you at the beginning, I think at this point we can safely say this is probably incorrect. This idea of a zenith, and this part illustrating the rate of change is probably also incorrect. But can we get to a different figure here regarding population? So I turn finally to settlement scaling theory. That is, that we can identify positive relationships between the scale of city with quantifiable aspects such as innovation, crime, and eventually population. And there are a few metrics, proxies that we could investigate here. Fires, for instance, the locations of these, but that is more illustrative of portents and prodigies and political disruption rather than the distribution of the population. Although one notable aspect we can glean from fires is that by the imperial period, we see far more fires in the outer ring of Augustan regions. We don't see fires, we see fires in the inner ring of Augustan regions in the Republican time. So again, indicative of change over time in the spatial configuration of Rome. absolute capacity, indicative of population increase, but it doesn't really provide a firm indication in any measurable sense. I've also quantified innovation. We can envisage the idea of more innovations, more change over time, and by extension, possibly population increase. As to the rate of change, it's not particularly, it doesn't illustrate that much. And when put together, and I've included housing here as well, the earlier graph, we see a variety, well, it's quite convoluted, quite complicated. And I think we can overall see growth over time across the Republican period when these proxies are considered. That's for the most informative proxy. That is debatable. I think there's a good case that housing is the most useful one, that this curve here is quite useful. But this doesn't really give us any insight into population over time. And this is where I turn to the population density method to close out the presentation today. So often asserting figures for population, what scholars do is they base these off urban urban units. They look at the scale of these, hypothesize how many individuals might have lived there, dependents, slaves, enslaved population, and then this is extrapolated across the entirety of the built area to give a final population estimate. Clearly, given the evidence I've shown above, this isn't really suitable for late Republican Rome. We don't have the definable bedrooms or spaces allowing this to be gauged. But what we can do, it's not a hopeless situation. What we can do is reflect on plausible population figures and densities. So, plausible figures for urban spaces, Pompeii at 166 individuals per hectare, or Ostia, 317 individuals per hectare. The highest in a recent sample by Hansen and Ortman is, I think, about 600 individuals per hectare. And if we go back to this 1 million estimate, if we take the area for Rome that I think to be densely occupied, that being the area enclosed by the Serbian wall, well, the problem here is that these traditional estimates of 1 million or 750,000, these give extremely high density figures of individuals at 2,000 and, well, roughly 2,000 individuals per hectare. And I don't really think this to be plausible, given the nature of the evidence asserted above. More plausible is, I think, a far lower range, given that we are dealing with many atrium houses, many elite houses abundant across the city. And I think more reasonable is a lower population, somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000. This is consistent with the locations of the houses and their archaeological character. So, this, I think, is the more likely representation of Rome's population when graphed. And I think there could be alternative explanations for this, either that the evidence I presented a misleading interpretation of how we could define a city, that more evidence beyond the Serbian wall ought to be considered, or that either the exercise of population densities is misleading, or that we have far more individuals living in quite execrable urban conditions, permitting a far higher density. But I think the option I presented here today, that we're dealing with a far lower population, is the most plausible one. So, to conclude, I return to the importance of urban theory, and I start with a paradox. Urban theory is, of course, important, how we define a city and visualize change. But at the same time, this is entirely dependent on the questions of research. If we're dealing with quantifying the city and we need something quite definite, yes, of course, it's important. If we're dealing with other aspects, experience, urban identity, less to a lesser extent. There's a second paradox, that of housing. It is, in fact, I believe, more abundant and indeed more useful than one might suppose from existing scholarship. And at the same time, a lot of it is extremely fragmentary, challenging to interpret, and I would like very much to have the time to explore more in more detail this sample of housing, hopefully after the PhD is finished. But what we can nevertheless conclude from this is that Rome's population grew tremendously across 200 to 31 BC, and that the first century BC, and in particular by the middle of the first century, this was a time of especial growth. Whilst we have, I think, inflated perceptions of the rate of change across the second century. And the reason for this, I think, is due to a reliance on the works of Livy, his detailing of public building activity in the first decades of the second century BC. And I think the collection of housing has perhaps distorted this idea of urban change over time. As to where growth occurred, I still think predominantly within the Serbian Wall, that this area was increasingly densely occupied across the late Republican period, and that Horthy emerged to become a boundary precluding further residential expansion, and that this pattern shifts from the Augustan period onwards. This is bolstered by housing. We see that most of these are elite residences, they're quite sumptuous, and that the articulation of the Roman house this mirrors many of the trends evident across the Italian peninsula, that we start with atrium houses, these add-on peristyles, these increase upwards and outwards, but overall there's an extreme displays of wealth evidence across the city and through this body of evidence. And finally, when we quantify all of this, when we put it all together, I think we're dealing with a Rome in all likelihood smaller than traditionally envisaged, that an urban population of 1 million does not really seem to be viable and ought to be reassessed, and that a smaller Rome is more plausible, but that Rome's population ultimately reached its greatest urban extent later, between the middle of the first century AD and perhaps at the time of the Antonine Plague. So, I'd just like to thank the people who've helped me with all of this, my two supervisors, Professors Andrew Wilson and Dominic Maschek, to the BSR as well, where I stayed and completed some of this research, the Craving Committee for helping me fund some of this, and then to the Roman Discussion Forum, who has heard an earlier version of this research paper. And finally, I'd like to thank all of you today here for kindly listening to this. Thank you very much.